sponsored by the James Madison Council and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. My name is Elizabeth Egan, and I'm from the New York Times Book Review, and I am here today to talk with Margot Livesey and Sue Miller, authors of The Boy in the Field and Monogamy. To learn more about our authors, check out loc.gov/bookfest. And before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will save the last 10 minutes of this 30-minute live event to respond to audience questions. So you can feel free to start submitting your questions right now. I look forward to seeing them. Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to see both of you and really honored to be talking with you today. I'm going to begin with what I think is kind of an inspiring question for any reader. The theme of the book festival this year is Open a Book, Open the World. So I was wondering, Margot, maybe we'll start with you first. If you could tell us how books have opened the world for you.
What a fantastic question. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the library. I began reading was the only thing I was praised for as a child. My father had a bookcase that stretched from floor to ceiling, and I was allowed to read anything that I could reach. And I read wildly and inappropriately. I read Aldous Huxley. I read Jane Eyre. I read Conrad Lorenz. I read Mrs. Beeton's Cookbook. I tried to read Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson. But what thrilled me was the idea that I could open a book and I could go to some completely different place. And I particularly remember reading The Nun's Story and thinking, oh, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to wear a black and white habit and go to Africa and help people.
Mm-hmm. Sue, how about you?
I had much the same experience, actually, just that my father too had and my mother, she sort of lived in the evening in his study, but his study was full of books. A lot of them were in other languages, so they didn't really interest me, and they were his professional books. But they also had a bookshelf that was full of books of all kinds of books. I mean, sort of ridiculously different. None of them had a jacket. None of them had a cover, which I still, I love opening a book that doesn't have a cover that tells you what it's going to be about. And that was the way it was for me as a kid, just opening up a book and either being swept away by the first lines or not. In addition, my father read to us. There were 4 of us, and he read aloud to us. And he would read anything you asked him to read. I mean, I can remember asking him to read Katie Keene comic books, and he would read those, giving them his all. He was a wonderful Eeyore, sort of self-pitying and mopey. But he also, he read things that were more for the boys. And we sat there and listened to his family Robinson, and and then just really anything. And it was just a pleasure to hear his voice. And I hear his voice sometimes in my head when I read now.
I loved what you said about not loving a book, about loving books that don't tell you everything in their cover. Right. Because one of the things I loved about Monogamy is the plainness of the cover. It didn't give away a lot of the story. In fact, I would say the same thing about The Boy in the Fields. Just simple. The story is contained in the book. It's not told to you on the cover. I also appreciate that. I thought these 2 books were paired so perfectly together because they both begin with a big explosion, a big event that we then see the fallout of, rather than leading you up to a big event. And I was wondering if well, this is kind of a harder question, asking you to sum up your books for people who haven't maybe read them yet. But I was hoping that you could each talk a little bit about what your book here is about, and also about your decision to begin with that big event and to move on to the fallout from there. And maybe we'll begin, Margot, let's begin with you again.
I had the idea for The Boy in the Field. It came from a story told by an old school friend I hadn't seen for many years. He had found the body of a young woman who'd been murdered at the bottom of his garden. But what struck me was how his life was radically changed by the experience of, probably he spent less than 10 seconds in her presence, but his whole life took a different course. And in my novel, The Boy in the Field, I didn't want to have yet another dead girl or dead woman in fiction. So the boy is wounded, but not fatally. And 3 teenagers walking home from school, Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan, find him and get help. And each of their lives over the next few months, it takes a different course. Matthew becomes a kind of detective trying to solve the crime. Zoe begins to look for romantic love. And Duncan, the youngest, who's an artist, suddenly realizes that he would really, really like to discover who his birth mother is. And happily, he has help in the form of a almost perfect dog called Lily.
I loved Lily. Sue, how about you?
Yes. Well, I did have a little bit of an introduction to the characters.
You did.
I think that the main event doesn't happen until about a quarter of the way in, but it's a death, and it's the death of one of the main characters. And I essentially, in a certain way, proceeds a bit the way Margot's does, in that it observes the different responses of the characters and as to the death. He's been a very dear figure. His name is Graham, and he's sort of the male lead in a certain way. And he's a very, he needs love a lot, but he's generous with his love. And so he has had an enormous impact on the people that I trace through. And they're sort of introduced by his wife, who has the job of calling each of these people. Her daughter, first of all, with Graham. Then she calls Graham's first wife, who's been incredibly involved in their marriage, very close to both of them. And then we go to that character who calls her son with Graham, the first wife. And so you sort of get introduced to them as they're responding to this event, to Graham's death. And then the book subsequently moves around, much as Margot's does, among these characters, and sort of takes them up, looks at what their response is like and what it's doing to other people in the book, and ends again with Annie, the main character. So they're similar in some ways, I think, in their wish to look at the way a very dramatic event affects a lot of people, and the way those reactions affect others within this circle of people.
Yeah. There were a lot of ties, I think, between both novels that I found really powerful. You both wrote about big clans. Well, I guess in the case of the Langs, it was one family, but I sort of had a sense of the sweep of their family. It felt very broad. And in the case of Graham and Annie's marriage, we just have a sense of the breadth of the world they've created with their families. I wanted to find out, this might be, again, a harder question to answer, but how you managed to hit the sweet spot between the unrealistically perfect family and the completely dysfunctional family. Both the families in both of these books are relatably dysfunctional, but they're not. These are not depressing books. I felt like you found the balance, and I was wondering how you did that. Sue, maybe we'll begin with you this time.
All right, I'm up for it, I guess. It's my turn. I think basically what I think my own interest in them and my own enthusiasm for them and my own sympathy for them, I hope that's what would do it. I mean, I tried to give them each the version of themselves that was, present the version of themselves on the page that was sympathetic in spite of their anger at each other sometimes, their unreasoning anger at each other, in spite of their not so very polite behavior to each other from time to time. But I always see that as my job, in fact, to sort of enter a character who is not necessarily entirely sympathetic and make you understand enough about him to perhaps feel sympathetic, but at least to deeply understand him and I hope feel like moving around within the book with that character. And in this case, with multiple characters, even some minor characters are there too.
Margot, how about you?
That's such a wonderful description, Sue, of how monogamy works and how I responded to your characters. In the case of the Langs, my family, I kept in mind what Catherine Mansfield said in her diary. She says something like, even in the happiest of families, everyone is struggling for independence, for autonomy, to sort of find themselves. And I hope that I showed Zoe, Duncan, and Matthew, I hoped I showed their affection for each other, but also their desire to make their own way in the world. And I also tried to make the parents who do not have a point of view be complex and sympathetic in their relationship, both with their children and with each other. And I tried to suggest that they are also all part of a community in this small town where they live.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny. I had forgotten that the parents don't have a perspective, because I felt very much, I felt a connection to them as I was reading, and I heard their voices in my head also, which is a tribute, I think, to the power of the story. Sue, you mentioned in your acknowledgements that the writing of monogamy was a bit of a drawn out process. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and perhaps share some perspective and wisdom for anyone who's watching right now, who's having a similar experience with a writing project.
Yeah, I do think it gained from that experience. I wouldn't have wished it on myself ahead of time, nor do I wish it on anyone else. Mm-hmm. But I feel as though the time it took, which involved time away from it for various reasons through those years, but the time it took let me think about them, let me come to know them better, let me experiment. I think I would come back to it and write things that I never really used, but they were there for me in any case. I did, in fact, write many pages, at least probably half as many again as got into the book. And I don't recommend that to anyone, but they informed me, I have to say. Saying no to them was an important part for me of coming to yes, which I did. So it was interesting to me always what I was doing, but I didn't quite understand some of it until later. And some of it that sort of seemed random to me, let's just get some writing done today, ended up being some of the good stuff that I then expanded on and used in the book.
Did you ever have a moment where you thought about giving it up? I hope not.
No, but I did not. I mean, I just have never had that moment with a book, actually. I've always thought, okay, just go. You just started in the wrong place, so you need to start anew, and you need to throw this out. But I've never thought, I sort of make an enormous number of notes before I even start writing, so that I'm already really committed and I know what I want to do. I've figured out where it's going and how I want it to end. And then I just have to change the way I'm getting there or something like that.
Margot, you write from the perspectives of each of the children in the Lang family. Duncan was my personal favorite, just truly a special human being. And I was wondering if you wrote straight through for each character, or if you wrote the story in chronological order, how you kept track of those voices in your head.
I did not write. I did write straight through. I didn't write, a long Matthew section and then a long Zoe section, because somehow what I was looking for was always the counterpoint, if you will, between their voices and their points of view. But that said, like Sue, I wrote perhaps a couple of 100 pages that went into recycling when I tried things that, for one reason or another, I thought diluted the book and didn't make it work. And I was always really interested in how the characters sort of threw each other into relief, like in King Lear, when Goneril and Regan throw Cordelia into relief, or Edmund throws Edgar into relief. So I thought of the characters in a much less dramatic way like that.
Between the two of you, I think you have written more than 20 novels. And I'm not exaggerating when I think I say I've read them all. And I was curious to know, for real veteran novelists like the two of you, how do you move from one project to another? Once you're finished with your book and it's published and you've spoken to people like me and talked to book clubs, if you talk to book clubs, and had readings, how do you get your head in the mindset of the next project? And do you feel homesick for the world that you just created? Sue, we'll begin with you. Put you on the spot.
You need to be the boss here, apparently.
I am.
You are.
It gives me a great sense of power.
Yeah, I hope so. Gosh. I never feel homesick because when you get to the last 40 pages or whatever, you're just so eager to get to the end. And, much as you may have loved them, you're really glad to see them go. So goodbye, off you go. You take care of yourselves in the future. Which is not to say I don't think about them sometimes as characters, but I think that I've always been done when I'm done. And actually, I find it usually fairly easy to, when I was younger and sort of, I didn't start publishing anything till I was 46. So I had a lot of pent up energy to write things. And with each book, I was ready and had made notes for the next one before I finished. So I was indeed ready to go and to leave them. It's gotten slower for me as I've gotten older, and I've written a lot of books that I liked. But I'm having trouble now, for instance. So this means I make a lot of notes. I just sit down and just say, it could be this. And the next day, it could be this. And just keep trying until I've generated something that excites me. And at this point, I have, several strands, too many strands, and I'm fishing around. So I have to say, it has gotten harder for me because I'm old.
No, you're not. But I'm inspired by the not writing until you are 46 part. I like that. Margot, how about you?
I think, like Sue, by the time I reach the end of something, one of the ways I can tell I'm reaching the end of a novel is that I start having ideas for other characters. I start being unfaithful to them, if you will. But that said, I do find myself for months afterwards going around the world thinking, oh, that would be so perfect for Duncan, or if only I'd thought of that for Zoe. A friend of mine was once thrown out of a bookshop for making alterations in her books, and I do have some of that impulse. So it can be really, really hard to move on and to attach myself to new characters.
I always wonder if authors, you don't have to answer this, but if authors, when they're reading, either in a bookstore or if you read your own audiobook, if you make little tweaks along the way. I guess with the audiobook, you probably can't do that, but I think I would be tempted. Like, it would be hard to know it's done now. Anyway, I'm going to ask you our very first question. I will move into the question portion of our talk. And the first question comes from Patricia. She says, you both write the interiority of characters so beautifully. What is your process for getting into the minds of your characters and hashing things out? And Sue, we're going to start with you this time.
Okay, thank you. I make notes. I write in longhand, and I write in the same books that I've already just made a lot of notes. And they're really, I sort of make very short notes. She likes this, she hates this. I mean, sort of things which let me enter them without sort of entering the seriousness of the book, as it were. And then sometimes I write, he says this, she says this. I mean, I just sort of make notes that present, for instance, the fundamental argument between two people. He believes this, she believes that. So that's going to be the crunch, but it is entering each person first. And I think because I make a lot of notes, I feel ready. I feel ready when I start to write, that I understand them ahead of time. I mean, some things obviously come to me. I mean, I don't write the book ahead of time. I'm writing the book, but I feel ready to let them play with each other on paper because I know them.
Margot, what about you?
I would say that I keep looking for the essential gesture or the telling detail. That in my early drafts, so many of the details are dull or predictable. They're just placeholders. And I keep thinking, how can I make this more intimate, more personal, more completely apposite for this character? And that for me is often a rather slow process of negotiation and of looking at the world and remembering how really complicated people are in real life, and how can I get that complexity or some of it onto the page.
Our next question comes from Freya K. Oh, I love this question. Who were the writers or teachers who inspired you to pursue writing? And do you learn anything from your own students that informs your writing? And this time, Margot, we will begin with you.
I think what inspired me to write was not a particular person, but the books I loved reading and wanting to make my own book, wanting to be the person behind the covers of a book. That said, I was very fortunate to spend 7 weeks meeting weekly with the Irish-Canadian novelist Brian Moore, when he was a writer in residence at the University of Toronto. And he was unbelievably helpful to me. Even though I was a waitress at a local restaurant, I would take off my apron every week and go and ask him questions about a story. And I would say that I'm fortunate to be constantly inspired and challenged by my students. I work with wonderful young writers, and it's a huge privilege to be among their early readers, but also makes me feel I have to try to keep my own standards very high.
I haven't taught as much as Margot, and I've had some wonderful experiences with students, it's true, but I feel the main thing for me has been reading. That when I'm in doubt about my own work, I read someone I admire a lot, and even if their way of proceeding fictionally is incredibly different from the way I proceed, it excites me, and getting excited is really important, and sort of makes me feel, yes, fiction can be very, very good. I mean, I think, so I use the books that I love I use them over and over, actually.
I think it's a little bit like listening to beautiful music. If you want to be inspired, reading beautiful words or words that are in the vein of what you're writing, I think can be very, very helpful, which is partly why I feel like it's always easier for me to write a positive book review, because I have that beautiful, a voice I love in my head. Okay, let me take the next question. This comes from Guy. Both your books focus on sad and tragic events. How closely do you identify with their characters? And we sort of already covered this, but do you become attached to them? How do you live with how did you live with the heaviness of the subject, I think, while you were writing these books? Margot, back to you.
Well, my book opens with a sad event, the injury of the boy who's found in the field. But actually, most of the novel is not sad. I mean, the crime and the solution to the crime is going on in the background all the time. But in the foreground are the lives of these three teenagers with their curiosity and their appetite and their eagerness to find certain things. So I did not feel I was living in a sad world. And I did become attached to my characters, partly by making sure that each of them had something they shared with me. And I won't tell you what that is.
Why not?
Later.
Margot, I have to tell you, I live with a bunch of teenagers. So when I was reading your book, I thought, let's see if she gets this teenage thing right. And obviously I haven't been a teenager for a long time, but it felt, you really slipped quite effortlessly, it seemed to me, into the mindset of three pretty different ages. And to me, it rang very true. So congratulations on being able to tap into your former adolescent in some way. Sue, how about you? How did you live with kind of the aftermath? Graham is such a larger than life character. I really missed him when he was gone. How did you handle that?
Well, but he lives on in memory, of course. All of the characters spend some time recollecting him and thinking about him and trying to get to him in some way in memory and find comfort in that. But I have to say that I think one of the great pleasures of writing fiction anyway is to have terrible things happen. You write about it very cold-heartedly. You say, this is great. People are really going to suffer here. I'm going to get to write about them. And there's a kind of, meanness, I suppose, in all of that. But it's pleasurable to write about a shocking, terrible thing and to find the words to do it and to look at it carefully and make it convincing. There's nothing better.
I think we have time for one more question. And this is a perfect way to end. Would you be willing to share the best piece of advice you received early in your writing careers that helped you grow the most? And this question comes from Laura B. Margot, I'm going to put you on the spot first yet again.
Well, of course, teaching, I aspire to follow the advice I give my students, and I often, I confess, fail to follow that advice. I think the best advice I got was from Brian Moore, who made me realize that revision could make all the difference. I didn't have to have a perfect first draft. I just had to have a draft. And once I had that, once I could start making it better. First, I sort of made the clay, and then I shaped the clay into, I aspired to shape the clay into a beautiful vase. So revision is, for me, is absolutely key in writing.
Sue, what's the best wisdom you received early in your career?
I didn't talk to people very much about my writing early in my career. I mean, I spent a long time writing by myself before I, and then I published a book. And I think, I wrote 2 novels that I never took anywhere or tried to get published. So I guess my self-instruction was just to wait till something was good enough to present it to other people, not be in a rush. Later, I think more recently, my wonderful first literary agent, when I'd written some material that she didn't think was strong at all, said to me, "You're not doing the thing you do best." And I said, "Oh, what is that? Please." And she said, "You make scenes." And I realized she was right, that what I had been writing was this sort of interior thing that wasn't very alive. And what makes things alive on the page, for them to be alive, for things to happen, for scenes, for people to talk to each other, confront each other, with something to happen to people and between people. So that was enormously helpful to me to actually think, yes, that's true, isn't it? So.
Well, I'm very sorry to report, ladies, that we are out of time. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you. I would love to meet both of you in real life one of these days. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
Talking to me. And to all of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the National Book Festival. And please be sure to check out all the festivities at loc.gov/bookfest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sue. This was fantastic.
It's lovely to see you again.
This was a real treat.